Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in today's video, we are going to cover Plasticity 2026.1. So we finally got the release for this year. I'm happy to say that the UI looks pretty much the same as it did in 2025, which means that any of the videos that we have from 25 are going to look and feel the same. There are, of course, new tools. There are plenty of improvements. Some shortcut keys may not work exactly the same, but hopefully in this video we can cover a lot of that. If you haven't seen our What's New content before, we're going to try to cover as much as we can. I'll put chapters in the bottom of the video so you can jump ahead, but I'll leave a link in the description of the video so you can jump to the Plasticity website that covers it all. Also keep in mind we are an affiliate, so if you are looking to purchase and you want to support the channel, you can use our code LEAD10. That'll save you 10%. It also does help us out. So the first tool or the first new feature that we have is something called Polysplines. There are several cool things that we can do with this. This is going to need its own video, but the two big things to note are, one, this is a studio-only tool. So this is a new technology, kind of like XNURBS, that Plasticity has licensed, which means that it's only available in the studio license. So if you're wondering, Indie or Studio, Studio has a lot of tools like XNURBS. It's got some different CAD conversion tools for imports and exports. So there are various things that Studio only does bring to the table. I would suggest taking a good look at everything it can do if you're trying to make that decision, or ask questions in the video. So what does this Polyspline tool do? Well, basically it's a sub-D converter, and it also opens up some other modeling functionality. Again, we'll have to cover in its own video. But the first thing is, if you bring in a quad mesh like an OBJ or an FBX, we can convert that directly to, in this case, a NURBS surface. And what this means is we now have the ability to just model directly on this. If you want to, you can grab these faces. I'm going to go ahead and just switch to face selection. You can grab these faces and pull them out and make geometry changes. We can also do things like, let's go ahead and let's add a line here. And then I'm going to turn that into a slot, which is another new feature, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. And then I want to extrude that. All right, so my curves, I'm going to get rid of the line. And then I'm going to take this slot and just extrude it. I'll pull it this way, hit S, hit W, get rid of it from that. And you can see that we were able to just basically cut straight through it. So bringing in a quad mesh and having the ability to not only manipulate it with standard tools, but also do things like adjust the shape and kind of work back and forth. So that on its face is a really helpful tool. There will be limitations. You can't use it on an STL. So if you have a triangular mesh, it's not going to work. It does need a quad mesh, but the results are going to be G2 continuous. So a really nice output. But the other thing that this opens up, which is really cool, is the ability to use the Blender bridge in two directions. And so to look at that, let's go ahead and take a look at Blender and Plasticity together. So let's close the outliner and make it a little bit easier to see. So when we're looking at this, when we open up the Blender bridge, I'm going to go ahead and delete the cube in here. When we open up the Blender bridge, we can create a live link and refresh it so we bring our object directly in. You might be thinking that just looks like the Blender cube. The cool thing here is that we can make modifications directly inside of Plasticity, and we've covered this tool before. And those modifications are going to be live updated inside of Blender. So this functionality already exists. I don't believe it's studio only. I'm not 100% sure on that. But the thing that I know is studio only is going the other direction, going from Blender to Plasticity. So I'm going to disable the live link because there are some problems that this will bring up. I'm going to start a new design, just a general design. And I'm going to modify this cube. So I'm just going to extrude some stuff up. Let's go ahead and bring this out. Maybe bring this out and just make some sort of shape. Now, one of the keys to making this work, this might help if I show the whole thing, is actually adding a subdivision surface modifier. It does not work for my testing unless you have a subdiv modifier on here. The other thing that has to happen to make this work is inside of the Blender bridge, we're going to set this to only visible and refresh. And notice over here that we've got now an outbox and an inbox. Inbox is going to be a design coming from Plasticity into Blender. Outbox, which we'll drag this into, is going to be a design going from Blender to Plasticity the other way. So when we hit refresh, we now have our object directly here in Plasticity. We can still modify it in Blender. So for example, let's go ahead and pull this up, maybe add an extrude, maybe scale it out. And then we'll go ahead and refresh it. And now it's changed over here in Plasticity. There are going to be some best practices. I'm going to play around with this a bit more. Right now, it seems like you really just want one object in Blender and nothing in Plasticity, or one object in Plasticity and nothing in Blender. Of course, you can select what you want to take with you, but that seems to be the best thing. There are tools where we can do things like refacet, auto mark edges. Those are all things we've covered in previous videos, and there are tools like Peter at Take Refuge 3D has an Ngon tool that you can use to kind of help prep your models. But that's the basis of this. We can now use it not only to convert meshes that we bring in, again, they have to be quad mesh and FBX and OBJ, but we can also use it to bring files directly from Blender. So super cool add-in. There's more to that tool that we're going to have to get into in its own video, but just the core functionality of converting the mesh to a NURBS or converting a Blender file to something directly in Plasticity with that sort of refresh and live link. Both of those are, again, really cool features in Studio only. The next thing that we want to talk about, let's go ahead and while I'm here, I'm just going to create a new set of curves. So let's create a circle. Let's create some lines. I'm just going to draw some lines that go through here. This change is a little bit harder, at least for me to see. But now when we have curves that cross over and they're in the same construction plane, they will have a white dot on them. And so it's kind of hard to see. If I move this one here in Z and move it up, and then again, look at it from the top, this line here doesn't have any white dots where it crosses other curves. The other ones do. This is also true when it's in the corner. So we've got the purple sort of vertex dot, and then we've got the white dot where it crosses over. When you go into the preferences, you can modify the size of the vertices and control points and things like that. I have not found a way to increase the size of that white dot. That would be really helpful if we could make that more than a pixel or whatever it is. But again, that's just a nice visual indicator that helps you see, okay, well, this curve isn't even on the same plane. There are some other additions that we'll talk about later, like the patch tool, for example, now has the ability to make use of multiple sections, so we can patch just that instead of a complete closed profile that we needed. So those are, again, new additions that could be pretty helpful. While we're in this sketch, let's also go ahead and talk about that slot tool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this. Let's go ahead and move this around. The slot tool is something where you need to have a seed or basically a starting point. And when you select it, you can invoke the slot command. And what this allows us to do is take polylines like these lines. We can even do it with a circle. Let's go ahead and do that. And you can use things like complex curves like splines, and we can convert those to slots as well. And so this is a really nice addition. It's not a standard curve tool that you'll find over in this sort of toolbar on the left-hand side, but you do have the ability to take these basic polylines or complex curves and turn them into slot geometry. Now, obviously, there are certain cases where this makes a lot of sense, things like creating vents or features on the outside of cosmetic models, but you can also use it for mechanical parts as well, dictating the location of, let's say, hardware that needs to slide through a slot. So that's a pretty nice addition. Some other changes that have happened, let's go ahead and I'm going to open this file here. Some other changes that have happened have to do with things like 2D curve snapping. So this is one that is probably a pretty big enhancement, even though it seems minor, and we'll talk about this in this case. So if you're using the default construction planes, things like top, front, right, left, whenever you start to create a curve, if you snap to geometry that's not in that plane, so you'll notice I snapped to the top of that hardware and I kind of came down here, it's going to be located at that first snap point. Now, if we go to that top plane and I enable 2D snapping, and I do the same thing again, I'll just snap over here, come to the bottom, maybe come to the top over here. What's going to happen now is that is going to stay on our construction plane. And so you can see that even though I snapped to the top of that little bolt, it stayed at the top plane. And so this is a nice feature. This is how it behaves when you create custom construction planes. And now we have the ability to do that on all planes by forcing it. All right, for the next example, I'm going to go ahead and open up another file. Now what I want to talk about is some changes that have happened to the outliner. And so for this, I'm going to make a duplicate. And then over here, I'm going to create a group from the selected item, and I'll do the same thing here. Now there are shortcuts. You can do Control-G or hit that button up there. But essentially what's happened now is we have the ability to activate groups. And so this is important because if we start to create geometry, let's say a cylinder, by default, it would just be in the solids section of the outliner. Now we have the ability to activate a group, which means that if I create new geometry, it's going to go into the active group. So as you're creating big complex models, as you want to start keeping features and designs grouped together, being able to activate a group, activate the top level scene or any of these subgroups, that gives you the ability to control and dictate the function and the structure of it without having to do it after the fact, like by grouping stuff together after you model or dragging it into a group. So this is a really nice addition. This is something that's going to improve a lot of workflows. Another addition that happened is inside of materials, the very bottom, we now have the ability to add a density. And the reason this is important is because at the bottom on the right-hand side, we now have the mass of our object. And so you can see here, this is 39,000 grams in ABS plastic, essentially, is 1.07. If I click on the one that I didn't apply a mass to or a density to, you can see that it's not listed there. So that information, not just the color or the appearance of it, but also the ability to dictate the density, can really help if you're creating designs you plan to physically make. If you want to see how heavy the final object is going to be in plastic or metal or wood or whatever the case might be. And so that's a nice addition. That's something that's, seemingly minor, but will make a big difference for a lot of people. In addition to that, we now have the ability to copy with materials. And so what this means is if I copy this solid and I start a new design and I paste it in here, let's go ahead and zoom to fit. That is going to bring that material with me. And so you can see the density is there. If I go into render mode, you can see it's shown as red. And so that ability to do that helps with things like kit bashing. So if you're creating a lot of parts that are going to be used in various files, now you can apply all the materials to them and you don't have to redo that when you bring it into the final design. So very nice addition to just the general properties in the outliner, being able to bring those over. We also have a search in here. I'm going to go back to the other file for this. But inside of here, you have the ability to search. You can use a shortcut key, Control and F, and you can begin typing what you're looking for. And so this is nice because sometimes when all these folders and groups are closed, it can be hard to find something. Sometimes as your designs get really big, then it becomes really hard to find stuff. And so in this case, if I'm looking for that front image, I can quickly find it and I can show it. And that's easy to do using, again, Control and F, which is the same thing that you use, use Shift and F out here or F, and then it's Control and F to search the outliner. The cool thing is a lot of times these commands only work when you're hovering over the outliner, but Control and F invokes the search command no matter where your cursor is. So that's a nice addition. While I'm on this model, also I want to talk about another new tool called Export Hidden Line. This gives us the ability to create essentially a drawing. Now it's not a detailed drawing, there are not a bunch of dimensions on it, but we can control things like shaded background or using colors or the specific views that we want. Like let's say that we just wanted to have a right view. And this can be used for things like, let's say that you want to do appearances for UV unwrapping, or maybe you want to take this and you want to use it for some art. You want to do some coloring and shading in a 2D art program, or whatever the case might be. We can now export these. Keep in mind, it will go into the folder location of your plasticity file. It will also share that name. If you happen to not have a plasticity file saved, then it will prompt you for that save location. Not a big deal, but just something to keep in mind. Generally, we would have a file saved anyways. All right, so now that we've talked about all the new features, let's take a moment to talk about some of the improved and enhanced features. Now, again, I'll put a link to the Plasticity website where you can see all of the changes. We're just going to cover a few here. The first thing I want to cover is the curve array. Now, with the curve array, we have a third option called transport. Now, normal and transport in some instances might look the same depending on the curve you're dealing with. If you have a curve in 3D like this one, then what you'll notice is the parallel option obviously will keep the object in the same orientation. Normal is going to be sort of rotating and skewing with the 3D curve. And the transport option actually gives you a better result in most cases because it uses a stable frame around the object that follows the curve and prevents twisting or flipping. So again, normal, you can see that the object is actually flipping around the curve, where the transport option gives you a little bit more of a stable result, which you would probably expect using that input. So again, that is not a new feature, but the transport alignment option is new for 2026. The next thing that we want to talk about is the align command. Now, we've done a video on this with align and surfaces, but in 2026, it now supports curves. And there are a couple ways that we can use this. One cool feature is that it actually knows where you're selecting. So for example, if I want to connect these two curves together and I accidentally select the curve on this side, when I go to use the align command, it thinks that I'm using this side based on my selection. So you can make sure that you select close to the edges you want. And then when you use the align command, you've got G0, G1, G2, and G3 continuity. We also have the widgets on the screen, these little yellow areas that we can move. And when we go to G2 continuity, you can see we've got our second one here, and G3, we got a third. Now, obviously, as you move around, what's going to end up happening, depending on the constraints around the rest of the curve, you're going to start to see that one end move. Very similar to how it works when we're dealing with surfaces, except for we don't have the control over like the degree and span that we do on a surface because we're dealing with just these control points. This also works on straight lines, which will only have G1 continuity, and it also will work on things like arcs and circles. And what's kind of neat about this one is you can use the parameter here to move around the position. All circles will have a start end point, so that'll be the 0 and the 1, depending on which direction you're coming from. This is not a replacement for a constraint system. It is not persistent, meaning if we try to take this curve and this one here and we align them, and we do G1, that is not persistent in the fact that we can still move this line around. We can rotate it, we can make changes, but it is a good temporary solution. And by temporary, I mean you can apply these sort of constraints on the fly as needed, but just keep in mind that as you move things around, as you move control points, it's not going to maintain the G1, G2, or G3 continuity. The next thing that I want to talk about is going to be instance support, and specifically in the place command. Now, we haven't really talked about instances on this channel, but I'm going to go ahead and create an instance. And if you don't know what this is, it's essentially a copy, but it's not treated like a true solid or brep. But it does maintain a link back to the original, so you can see I'm making changes to the original. If I move faces around or make adjustments, add fillets, things like that, it will all keep true with the instance. There are some other updates that have happened with things like the move gizmo. So by default, this transform instance inversely will be off, and that means that the instance will move with you. You can turn it on and move it independently. And also notice that we now are seeing the red, green, and blue sort of checks or marks next to X, Y, and Z to help you better identify which direction you're moving relative to the gizmo on the screen. But the main thing I want to talk about here is going to be that place command. Now, there are shortcuts for them, of course, but you can type place, click this. And what we're doing essentially is picking a location, a snap location, and then we're placing it on some other object. In this case, we can flip this around. Now, there are a couple new additions to this command. One is the ability for this to create instances instead of copying solid bodies. So if I were to place this here, what I have is a second copy of a solid of that. If instead, let's go ahead and hit I on the keyboard to toggle instances, what I'm doing now is I'm placing instances in those locations, which means they're going to maintain a link back to the original. Now, the reason that this is nice is because if I move the original and I turn off this, you can see that it's going to move all these objects around. Also, if I make changes to the original object, you can see that it's going to make changes to all those instances. So this is a really nice way for you to create a single version of a part, like a bolt or hardware, and place it around other objects while maintaining the ability to simply modify or edit that original. Even if this isn't used anywhere and it's just off to the side and hidden and not selectable or something like that, then you still have the ability to create all of these various instances. Now, instance support, and specifically with this command, the place command, it supports the placement of instances, whether they're pre-created or created with the tool. Also, you can use this tool on mesh bodies as well. Other tools like the mirror also support the creation of instances as opposed to copies of the solid body. So these are all nice additions and changes that can make working with patterned components or multiple instances of a body like this much easier, especially if you decide that you want to go back and make changes and things like that. Then all of those placed instances, which word is starting to lose a little bit of meaning, but all of them will follow the design changes that you make on the original. So one other thing to note is as we move between different files, in the past, the dialogue would say something like, "You sure you want to clear the scene?" Now it actually tells you if you have unsaved changes. Now the unsaved changes are denoted by the little white dot next to the file name. And so this can tell you like, hey, you sure you want to open a new file and not save what you did? And you can say yes, which you'll lose your stuff, or you can say no, go back and save it before you close. The next thing that I do want to talk about is the gizmo. In this case, I'll go back to move. And note that the options inside of here for tab, historically tab has done a few different things in different tools. So depending on where you were, if you were in extrude, tab used to make the extrude symmetric from the midline. Now the S key will do that, but tab is moving universally for dimension input. So if I hit tab, you notice it's going between X, Y, and Z. And even though the 0 isn't highlighted, I can start to type in 25, and I can type in 25, and I can kind of move through that. That sort of enhancement, or for the way that tab works, is being changed globally for a lot of these gizmos, so scale, rotate, move, to be more in line with how it works in other features. So for example, if I were to create a curve down here, and I wanted to extrude that, if I hit tab, it goes to the numerical entry. So I can hit 25, I can hit 2 degrees, I can go back to this, I can go to 10 degrees, whatever the case might be. So that tab is going through the numerical inputs, and it's no longer being utilized anywhere as far as I can tell for things like flipping the direction of an extrude, or in a 2D sketch for a rectangle, for example, it used to tab back and forth between making it a center or corner. Now it again tabs between the dimensions. So again, unifying that is going to help. That way it behaves the same no matter what you're doing. Another thing that's changed is inside of the assets dialog, or the assets tab here in the outliner, you can actually navigate this with the arrow keys now. Again, not really a crazy improvement, but a lot of times it is helpful to be able to use the arrows up and down going through your used materials. So just something to keep in mind, that slight little change, those can sometimes make a big difference as you're traversing through a ton of different materials that you've applied. All right, just a couple more of these improvements and enhancements I want to talk about. One is in the preferences. In navigation, there is a new rotation mode called ARCBALL. The ARCBALL rotation is slightly different. It's something that you probably will need to get used to. But one thing that happened with the old style of navigation is you would actually get stuck depending on the orientation you were relative to the XYZ coordinate system. The ARCBALL kind of gets rid of that, and it's something that you can play around with. There is also expanded space mouse controls and support. You see here lock horizon is on. That's not really a new feature, but there has been some changes to space mouse support, so that's something to look into in the link. The last two things that I want to mention are exports. And so if we go to export this design as an OBJ, at the very bottom in the advanced section, we now have a scale and the up axis. We can decide whether Z up or Y up. So this is a nice addition because a lot of times we would run into an issue where the orientation relative to how we modeled it may need to be flipped from Z to Y. There is inside of the plasticity page some information about different scales. And so it can tell you, if you're modeling in millimeters, use this scale. If you're modeling in centimeters and so on. The other change for export, if we were to export an STL, this doesn't have the axis and the scale like it does in OBJ because the export for STL is unitless. But what this does have now is an option to override the length. Now, again, this is unitless, but you can override the length or the unit that's being used here, which will affect or impact the scale when you take it to another program. A lot of times we'll bring something in and the default might be centimeters or meters or millimeters or whatever, or inches, and you're going into a metric system, and the scale is just kind of off. And again, in that help file on the Plasticity site, there is some notes about different scales for different programs and different situations. So there were a lot more improvements and enhancements. I probably only scratched the surface. Most of them are going to be, again, little things like seeing a color next to X, Y, and Z in the gizmos, or seeing different things like an extra option for Boolean support for certain tools. I would strongly suggest you just take a look. If you're not new to Plasticity, if you've been using it a while, there will be a lot of little things in there like support for extrudes, where you now have a new option inside the extrude dialog. If you're extruding a surface, for example, you've got this individual option. And so what this typically does is this will change the direction if you're extruding multiple things. And I'll show you an example down here. So if I select these two faces and I go to extrude them out, and I go to individual, it's going to use sort of a unified direction between those faces. It couldn't extrude it originally because it's normal to that direction, and that means ultimately that the side face here was not going to work. But using this individual option will kind of create a unified direction between the two selections. And so again, all these little options add up to improvements across the board of the software, not just in one or two little areas. If you have any questions on any of this, please leave a comment and let me know. Once again, we are an affiliate, so if you are purchasing Plasticity and you want to support our channel, then you can use the code LEAD10 at checkout, and that will save you 10%, and it does help us out as well. I'll also leave some links to other content that we have. Again, the UI has not really changed, so everything should be good to go for all the 2025 content. But any comments or questions, please let me know. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.